Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Good morning. I'm Leanne. I'm the lecture coordinator for the Peninsula Seniors. Today we're welcoming Brian Mew from LA Waterkeeper. Brian is going to be discussing the Kelp Restoration Project from Palos, Verdes to Malibu.
Hi, I'm Brian Mukes. I'm the Marine Program Manager for Los Angeles Waterkeeper, formerly known as the Santa Monica Baykeeper, if you've heard of it. It's a nonprofit environmental that engages the local community to fight pollution, number one. Habitat restoration and outreach and education are also important, but it's about fighting pollution that goes into Los Angeles County waters. So it's part of the Waterkeeper Alliance, and there's about 200 waterkeepers worldwide. They're all local. It's all about neighborhoods and just local people getting involved and saying, we don't want this pollution here. It's actually illegal pollution. What can we do about it? What I do out on the boat with kelp restoration and volunteer scuba divers from Los Angeles is a little bit different. It's the habitat restoration side of things. It's very unique for a waterkeeper to have that, and I'm proud to be a part of it. I came on in 2006 as a master's student looking to get into something new. And kelp restoration was new, it was unique. It basically let me pretend to be the marine biologist that I wanted to be when I was a kid. And so I volunteered, I got hired, and I've been coordinating the Kelp Project, trying to get volunteers on the boat ever since. And we've done a few other programs, but this has always been our main deal in the Marine Program of Los Angeles Waterkeeper. And so we're at a very important phase of the project now where there are more partners, there are more people involved in the project now. It's us. It's Santa Monica Bay Restoration Foundation, where my former mentor, Tom Ford, is leading the charge on this new and greater kelp project. He's working with us. He's working with California Science Center. He's working with California commercial sea urchin divers. And as well as our local marine biologist, the most active marine biologist in the water, which is Van Tuna Research Group of Occidental College. So we are now one part of this greater kelp project, which we're proud to lend our expertise to. So if you look at this slide, it's all about ecosystem protection and restoration at the Waterkeeper. This is the restoration side of things. And it's about response. If we've messed up in the past, if we didn't do it right, then we have to fix it somehow if the habitat means something to us. And so that's why, we have a boat right there in the center. There's a volunteer diver on board. And then those are kelp fronds just below the boat. And that's what we go out on about twice a week. So what is the marine program of the Waterkeeper, the side that's not dealing directly with storm water runoff and sewage spills of what the rest of the Waterkeeper is working on? We mostly work on the Kelp Project. That takes up a lot of time. We work on marine protected areas, and we have a program called MPA Watch, just to the right there, where we take people out on a boat for a half day, and they get involved in data collection of boating and fishing usage in relation to the marine protected areas to try to help inform the situation and what's going on. We deal with invasive species. We deal with abalone. We deal with oil spill prevention and response, which is the crude awakenings there. And we also work with Santa Monica Bay Restoration Foundation in the bottom right of the screen there on aerial surveys to also collect data about boating and fishing. The Kelp Project deals with an imbalance. If you have these urchin barrens, why are they there? One of the reasons is a lack of sea otters and a lack of a complete ecosystem underwater. And marine protected areas basically protect the entire ecosystem. So if you have restoration, if you have protection of the entire ecosystem, you control your invasives, you get your endangered species, abalone, back up into a healthy level of existence. you prevent an oil spill from happening in the area. That's somewhat of a comprehensive approach that we think we're taking at the Waterkeeper. So there is the kelp forest. That's the cathedral effect. So if it's a nice, bright, sunny day, there really are sun rays going through the top of the forest, and you can imagine a little mini giant kelp that is trying to grow up into a large one that is grabbing some of that sun, and it needs sun to survive. This is a picture of San Clemente Island. If you just start at Palos Verdes, head to Catalina, and keep going, you'll end up at San Clemente, where just beautiful, beautiful kelp forests exist there. They have amazing visibility, a lot of fish, and some fisheries there. The kelp forest still exists at night. So what happens at night is things come out. A night dive in the kelp forest is a very different experience than if you dive it during the day. And any good scientist will try to do night surveys as well as day to see what's happening there. So in terms of the diversity is important. That's your food web. That's all the interconnections that is needed in an underwater forest for this entire system to survive. That's composed of all these different types of algae, from the little crustose coralline algae on the bottom left to the feather boa kelp just to the right of that. And the giant kelp is in the middle. You have we have the sea palm or the Icenia to the right of that. And it's just an amazing diversity of algae. A lot of people, when they hear the word algae and seaweed, it's like, oh, I don't care about that. But these are the plants of this underwater forest, and they're the basis of the entire thing. Okay, the invertebrates, the spineless beings that are down there, basically is the definition of an invertebrate, that it does not have a spine. But it's an amazing diversity. From the upper right there, that pom-pom looking thing is actually a worm. It's called the feather duster worm, and it's beautiful underwater. You have a sea cucumber. As you go down, you have a crab. You have sea slugs on the bottom right there that are also colorful and gorgeous, as colorful as anything you see on a coral reef. I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about people who only do tropical diving and see coral reefs, because there's a lot of beautiful things to see here. And the fish. We love our fish, we eat our fish, and we go fishing for fish. We have an amazing diversity there as well. The rockfish, in particular, the top there, that's a copper. There's about 69 species of rockfish off the California coast. So it's very diverse. That's one genus and multiple species. And they're long-lived, they're slow-growing, they need protection, they need habitat. You have sharks in the middle there, that's the leopard shark. That, of course, exists in the kelp forest, beautiful fish. And you have, just to the left of that, the giant black sea bass, which is coming back. It was getting overfished in mid-century, and now the giant black sea bass is coming back. They banned gill nets, and these things get huge. I mean, that fish, next to that diver, the fish is closer to the camera, so it's a little bit bigger, but they get 6 to 7 feet long and hundreds of pounds. Being that big, nothing eats it, so it's very docile, and it'll swim right up to you, and its face will be right next to your face, and you could feel that the mouth of this thing could swallow your head, which it could if it wanted to, but it doesn't. So I just think it's interesting, just right off our coast here, there are fish that big. And then, of course, the great white shark in the bottom right corner. Doesn't exist, never happened, it's a big fantasy. No, I'm kidding. They're out there, and I've yet to see a great white shark on our dives here at Palos Verdes. They are more common, the juveniles, in Malibu. There's a lot of juveniles off of Malibu, and I don't know if it's because I have my head down and doing monitoring or restoration work, but supposedly they're there. Okay, so besides the intrinsic value of the kelp forest, the beauty of it, why we care about it, it's also good for us. It has ecosystem services. It provides us all sorts of benefits. Besides it being very diverse and supporting diverse food webs, it is actually a protector of our coastline. If you have a very thick kelp forest, it dissipates wave energy, meaning that it slows water down. If you have a house on the coast or a business on the coast and it's getting, and the coast is getting smaller and smaller and the beach erosion gets worse and worse, theoretically a kelp forest can slow that down and slow those waves down. Also, economic activities supported by kelp. There are a lot of recreational and commercial fisheries that would not exist if we didn't have healthy kelp forests. If you like eating local lobster, they need kelp forests. If you like the local crabs, the sea urchin fishery or the uni in sushi, that is based off of the kelp forest production. Recreational fisheries, if you go out on a boat and you see these guys fishing, they are fishing just on the edge of the kelp forest. You know, as a boater, you don't want to get your props stuck in this horrible seaweed stuff. But all the production that the kelp forest gives means you're catching kelp bass or perches or rockfish or sharks. It's great. Other uses are aquaculture. Basically, right now, they are feeding abalone on the Santa Barbara coast with kelp. So it can be all sorts of food for all sorts of species that are getting raised in aquaculture for human protein. Algin is an excellent chemical. It's an emulsifier, it's a stabilizer. It goes into cosmetics and paints and even beer foam and toothpaste. Anything gelatinous or squishy or gooey might have a kelp or seaweed product in it. Not to mention local tourism and recreation. A lot of local scuba divers, they dive because they want to see kelp forests. A lot of kayakers want to see something like a bird walking across the top of kelp. And just touching on this really quickly, kelp also washes up on shore and feeds the intertidal pools there. And so it also hits the beach, where if you're walking along the beach and you see these nasty, disgusting piles of seaweed with flies all over them, that's actually an energy input into that ecosystem. The flies eat it, the crabs eat it, the birds eat the crabs and flies, and so on and so forth. So how we manage it, whether or not we want to have a clean beach or a natural beach, maybe we need a little bit of both to balance people and nature. So where is giant kelp around the world? There's a lot of different types of kelp. And giant kelp, or Macrocystis pyrifera, is the largest, fastest growing kelp in the world. And we have it right here off of Palos Verdes in California. Up in Alaska, Chile actually has a good amount of kelp, as well as the southern tip of Argentina and South Africa, southern Australia, and New Zealand. That's all. That's where kelp naturally exists, and everywhere else they may have like a laminaria-based system or a bull kelp type system. But giant kelp gives the most biodiversity and production. What they're finding in a lot of these areas, if it's not managed right, is some decline. The common pattern that we're working with off of Palos Verdes is the one type of degradation transforming a kelp forest to an urchin barren. Here in Southern California, we've lost about 75% of the coverage of kelp forests. We see that same number off of Palos Verdes. I'll get into the next slide about how they count that. And not all of it is due to urchin barrens. I'll get into that in a second as well. So here's a little bit of data showing that trend line over the past 100 years. There was a guy who was in the Army, Crandall. He basically went out on a little boat with a compass and a sextant with 1911 technology and was asked to survey the natural resources of the coast and see how much kelp do we have. They were using kelp to create potash and basically weaponize it and use it for gunpowder. And so that's why they were so interested in kelp for the war effort at that time. But what they found was in 1911, that's the earliest data we have, there was a lot more kelp out there. Basically, why is this happening? We have overfishing effects. If we had the sea otter around, we wouldn't have the urchin barren problem. We used to have the sea otter in Southern California, all the way down, extending to about mid-Baja, where kelp forests naturally exist. There are Mexican kelp forests as well, I should mention. But it's not just overfishing effects that creates urchin barrens. What our top scientists in the area are finding is that it's a cumulative impact, which means that it's one thing and another thing and another thing. So you can't just reduce it down to one thing. That's one frustrating point to get across to a lot of folks who want to just identify one bad guy in the room. Coastal development in the form of runoff, sedimentation, and eutrophication also contribute to the formation of urchin barrens. Basically, if you have too much sediment on the reef, if you imagine a little microscopic kelp spore that is in the water column and it's trying to, well, I shouldn't say it's trying to, but it'll eventually land on a reef somewhere. It needs hard substrate, it needs rocky substrate, and if there's a lot of sand washing over the reef, then that little microscopic spore is not going to be able to grab on as well. Or it'll just get buried. So we actually have some reefs up in Malibu off the Las Tunas Canyon that are buried. And it's natural sedimentation, but that's one cause of this drop in kelp forests. Eutrophication, agricultural pesticides or urban runoff is often full of a lot of nutrients. And you think, oh, nutrients, that's great. We need nutrients. That can be bad because it creates a lot of plankton. This slide is green because, that is how a lot of it looks down there. It's just full of plankton. And so if it's full of plankton, all that plankton can block light. And if that light can't get down to the rocky reef surface, then how is that little microscopic spore going to grow up into an adult kelp plant? So that's why we see less kelp off the mainland than we do off the islands. The kelp, off that picture of San Clemente, kelp can grow from as deep as 100 feet below the ocean surface. But in the mainland, it's about 50, maybe 60 feet, just because there's not enough light down there off the mainland. And then natural causes of degradation, El Nino and La Nina. We have all sorts of natural causes of climate change. They're basically little temporary climate changes. El Nino is one of them. Every 7 years or so, we have warmer conditions in the water on the east side of the Pacific Basin. So California gets these nutrient-poor warm water conditions, which is not good for kelp. Kelp needs cold water and it needs high nutrients. And so El Nino stops that. El Nino years, we see a huge kelp die-off. And it's natural. There's nothing we can do about it. But if you have a healthy ecosystem, a complete food web, you have the sea otter, you have all the fish, all the invertebrates, all the pieces of this puzzle, it's often more resilient. It's healthier, it can bounce back quick. It's like, use the analogy of a sick person. A sick person falls down, and now it's like, I'm sick and I fell down. Whereas if it was a totally healthy person that fell down, they might be able to heal a little bit quicker. So if the kelp forest is sick, it may not bounce back from an El Nino like a healthy one would. So what does the Kelp Project deal with? We deal with the food chain effects. We deal with the predators. We deal with that top-down control that the sea otter provides. The sea otter in the bottom there is carrying up a giant red sea urchin to the surface so that it can eat it. That's what they do. They dive in these shallow areas in kelp forests, and they eat sea urchins, they eat clams, they will sometimes eat lobsters and crabs, although that's a little bit more of a fight. And they use tools to crack them open. And so that urchin there has a hard shell, it has sharp spines, it's a formidable prey for anything that doesn't have the ability to crack it open. That's why sea otters are so great. Sea otters also eat a lot. They may only be 60 or 80 pounds, but they don't have any blubber like seals and whales. They have thick fur. And although it's the thickest fur in the world, they need to eat a lot. They're like a marathon runner. They're always moving. They have a huge metabolism. They eat about a quarter of their weight per day, or 15 to 20 pounds of food a day. And they still maintain their figure. So the other two lesser urchin predators are the sheephead and lobster. And not to hate on the sheephead and lobster, they're great. We love them. We need more of them. But they're not the sea otter. They call the sea otter the rabid hydro weasel of the kelp forest, whereas the sheephead in the upper left, that is the male sheephead. It's a nice big fish. You see its jaws. It can take a purple urchin and crush it in its jaws. It's an amazing fish. They actually have a harem of females. They have an interesting life history. And if that male gets fished or dies, then the top female, the alpha female, will turn into a male and turn coloration and grow the big jaws and eat more sea urchins. So the lobster over there is the California spiny lobster. It's in Southern California, and with one of the next slides I'll show you is that it can control sea urchins as well, but it has to be abundant. You know, a lobster versus a sea otter is no comparison. There's one other mentionable. I just wanted to show you all a nice picture of a sunflower star, which is here also on Palos Verdes in abundance. These are quick-moving stars, and they will sometimes eat sea urchins too, but not nearly as much as the lobster or sheephead. This brings back a link I always like to refer to, which is how do kelp forests relate to marine protected areas? How does the Kelp Project fit in there? Well, basically, there was an Anacapa Island Reserve, which was established in 1978. It's been recently expanded, but this area has been protected for a long time. And there was a study done in 2004 to say, okay, let's look at all this long-term data and see what we have. Well, in the reserve, if you're not allowed to take lobster, one thing that they found was that lobster basically reproduced, became numerous, and controlled the urchin population. If you control the urchin population in this tritrophic system or three-leveled system, that means you have a lot of kelp. And if you have a lot of kelp, that means you have 800 species and that huge biodiversity. So this is one way where more lobsters means a lot more species. In the fished area, what they found was that there were much less lobsters, as you can imagine. Commercial recreational lobsters tasty, it's amazing. But that meant in these areas that urchins reproduced, like the sea otters around, the lobsters weren't able to control them, and not many kelp plants were able to grow. You didn't have as much of a forest and not as much biodiversity. So this kind of shows that we're becoming the lobster on the Kelp Project, and that, you know, maybe we could, instead of restoring everything, is to prevent it in the first place and protect a few areas for biodiversity. So now let's start talking about Waterkeeper's Kelp Project. I wanted to give you a little bit of background of the world that we exist in and why we decided to take action over 14 years ago and become the otter, control urchin populations, and get kelp forests coming back. They started off of Escondido Beach in Malibu in 1997. It was a pilot study until about 2001, where they started reducing urchin density, planting kelp, and doing the real work. It was about 2005, 2006 when Long Point Palos Verdes got started. That's the old Marineland area. It's now Terranea Resorts. This is what the site looks like when you first show up. It's a lot of urchins. Sometimes there's kelp, sometimes they're not. This was Palos Verdes, just off Long Point in one of our restoration sites, and that poor giant kelp plant in the middle there getting ravaged by urchins. It's probably not going to make it. And this is an example of my photography rather than our good friend Tom Boyd's photography, who's a professional underwater photographer who volunteers his time and comes out with us. That's Tom Boyd's photography. You can see the difference. And this is off of Malibu, where a lot of purple urchins and some red have overtaken a massive giant kelp plant and started eating the holdfast. Holdfast is the bottom part of the plant. And then once you do that, if you see the kelp plant in the background, those stems or shoots that go up are called stipes. And so if those urchins eat the bottom of that stipe, the whole frond floats away, and then you're left with this, which is just the base of the plant or the holdfast, and that's kind of how the deforestation process starts. I'll touch on abalone really quickly. We've had a massive decline of abalone in the past half century. It was through part by our harvesting and part by the withering foot syndrome. It kind of had a 1-2 punch there, and so we're part of efforts to bring the abalone back, and it's a competitor with the urchin. So if you can bring the predators of the urchin back and the competitors of the urchin back, maybe you can get some more urchin control and let nature do the work for you. That's just a picture of the amount of commercial abalone that was happening in the early part of the 19th century. There was just so much of it out there that pile right there is a pile of abalone shells, where one hard hat scuba diver is just sending abalone up to this group of guys who are shucking it, and it's just amazing. And so here's on top there is a recreational harvester. You're still allowed to harvest red abalone on the north coast of California, north of San Francisco, but everywhere else it's illegal. And so a lot of people are interested in bringing abalone back. Okay, what we used to do was relocate the urchins. We did that from 2000 until 2013. And that consists of this good soul volunteer scuba diver who volunteers for a day and helps us put urchins in bags and get them out of there. And you can see the rocks around the scuba diver. You know, that's basically what's left after you take the urchins off, because they've eaten everything else and it's just bare. But soon after that, kelp starts coming back. And this was a hard, difficult thing to do because it looks athletic, it looks great, but there's something called surge and ocean waves that really makes that difficult, where, you know, this diver's getting tossed around. These urchin barrens are in the shallows, and it could be thrown 6 feet in either direction. Luckily, the neoprene suit is very protective at the same time, but now we have a new technique that the California Fish and Wildlife actually promoted to us. And now we are, instead of just moving the urchins to an area probably where they most likely die anyways, you just directly thin out the sea urchins with a hammer. So it's easier on the scuba divers, it's quicker, you restore more kelp acreage, and it's a more direct approach than putting them in bags and dropping them off who knows where and letting fate decide. So it's always this time when I have to talk about the fact that it's not the urchin's fault. You see in this picture, this is another beautiful picture on a beautiful day out there. It never looks like this, by the way. The kelp, giant kelp is in the background there. You usually have an urchin barren right next to a kelp forest. And so you have, like, once you clear all the urchins, the kelp spores wash over the reef. So what you want to do is reduce that urchin density to natural levels. In a kelp forest, you have about 1 urchin per square meter. In this urchin barren here, it's more like 50 to 100. And so what is the most effective way to basically mimic the sea otter? And considering diver safety and everything, it's to reduce that urchin population the best way that you can. So that's how we're doing it, and we're getting a lot of kelp acreage restored. One thing that is interesting is that when you reduce the urchin density and kelp comes back, the urchins are healthier. They're sick here in this picture, they're emaciated, there's nothing left to eat, they're suffering, but when kelp comes back, they start eating more. Their favorite food is the giant kelp. They basically produce a greater commercial product for the commercial urchin divers. The uni becomes California gold rather than the urchin barren brown. And so it's better ecologically, it's better economically, and it's better for the individual urchins that remain. Here's kind of a picture of our site, how we do it. If you ask a volunteer to go down there and reduce urchin density, they're all over the map sometimes. And you have to lay out measuring tapes that serve as corrals to keep everybody in the same area. Otherwise, you end up just with a patchy mess down there. So that's kind of how we're doing it. You see that diver in the background there, they're already out of bounds. This diver's great, they're in bounds, they're going to work, and that shows you the tool that we're using. It has a blunt end on one side and a pointed end on the other side. The point here is to just get the urchins, not any other species that are down there that we're trying to save. And very recently we have found that kelp is coming back. So this is the beautiful part about kelp restoration as opposed to redwood restoration, for example, where because kelp grows so fast, if you allow it to grow, things in the ocean can grow very quick, and this plant right here is just a couple months old. Kelp can grow up to 2 feet per day if given the optimal oceanographic conditions. I mean, an average is more like a few inches a day, but this in the background, there's nothing back there but fuzz or turf algae, because the urchins there have been reduced and that giant kelp spore landed on the rocky substrate, put out its roots, so to speak, and started growing. So I wanted to show you that we're already seeing some good results. And now, I shouldn't date myself, but we have about 12-foot to 15-foot plants in the site. This is one of them, and it shows you the scimitar blade that happens with giant kelp, where it's an algae, it's not a plant, so it grows new branches by one blade splitting off, and that's what you see there. One blade is actually becoming multiple blades. Kind of a funky alien thing that makes for great pictures. And so one question that may come about in people's minds is, what are their methods? Why can't you just go down there and plant the kelp? Well, they tried that in the early years of the Kelp Project, and the urchins eat the kelp. And so it's a problem, thus meaning reducing urchin density is the #1 method. But they tried deploying sporophyll bags, which basically is the mimic of an adult kelp plant. So at the base of every giant adult kelp plant is kind of a bush of spore-bearing blades called sporophylls. And at the base of this plant, one plant can basically spread millions of spores out onto the reef. So if you collect those little blades from a plant and put them into a mesh bag, attach it to a string and a weight, and hang it on the reef, you get the exact same effect, where all those spores are still washing over the recently cleared reef. So we've found observationally that this has worked, but I think it'd be a great project for a PhD student or other researcher. If you're doing a massive, large-scale restoration like this, there's so many opportunities for students to do little side research projects and help us learn about the kelp forest. Now, the kelp outplants, this is where the urchins and everything else ate the kelp that they put out there. But it was a great project. They basically partnered with local schools to get kids growing kelp in their classrooms. And that's what's on the upper right there, is a cart full of kelp tiles. And they had the kids grow the kelp, and the kids would give the kelp to divers, and divers would take it out and strap it to the reef, like the bottom left and right there. And it was great for outreach and education, got all sorts of kids involved, got their imaginations going. But the kelp got eaten, so it was depressing and sad, and then they stopped it. Now, you really just have to use your time and resources carefully if you're limited. And so we're just focusing on mostly that restoration now. And just so you know, there's plenty of monitoring going on. Palos Verdes is now becoming one of the most studied peninsulas in California. There is the monitoring that is going on with the Kelp Project. There's the monitoring going on with the Greater Kelp Project all over PV. And the Van Tuna Research Group has been monitoring this area for years. They have one of the longest term data sets in California for any area. And so it's just a very well understood system that we're working in here. And we also get volunteer scuba divers to go out and train with us in species ID and methodology and learn how to do this. And some of them are students that are furthering their marine biology career by doing this. That's a few of them. Some are actors, some are medical workers, some work for the tech field, and the one in the middle there is a marine biology student. So it definitely gets all kinds and gets them on the boat and gets them talking. That's back to our sites again, just to remind you where it is. Next, I'll show you a little bit about the methodology of how this is set up. So this is Malibu, Escondido Beach, and the yellow squares are the restoration sites. That's where you're actually either planting kelp or reducing urchin density, and that is where you're monitoring, you're doing your work. But how do you know that it's your work that is actually restoring the kelp forest? What if there's some, amazing La Nina conditions which makes kelp grow everywhere? You need controls. You need to be monitoring areas where you're not working in to compare the areas where you are working in. And so that's what these reference and control sites are. You want them to be outside. And one thing we found was that your controls, if they're too close to the restoration sites, they get affected by it and might get restored themselves. So here is Long Point or Terranea. And you can't even see the control and reference sites in this picture because they're about a mile away. And same thing here, where you have the yellow boxes, which are your restoration sites, and the purple area is the last site that we were working in. I mean, that's right where people are kayaking and swimming and diving, and we wanted to restore an area so that people could see it. This is a picture of Escondido Beach before, and this is what it looked like just a year afterwards. Honestly, I can't believe how quickly some of these invertebrates grow. If you look at the giant kelp, yeah, that can come back in a few months. That's expected. It's great. But if you look at the bottom of this slide and those gorgonians or sea fans, those combined with the bryozoans and the tunicates and the sponges and all the other encrusting marine life, it grows quickly. It's just kind of shocking. I think it's amazing. And now we're just monitoring it. That's one of our volunteers. She now works at the California Science Center. And that's all we're doing is just monitoring it, see what the long-term effects of the restoration are. Here's Long Point before. a very different type of reef, high relief or large cliffs and caves, and just a huge area to restore. And this one took a couple years to basically make some progress on this site. But now we have kelp coming back, and dare I say, that is a male sheephead in the center there, in this blurry Sasquatch type of photo here. But that's what you want. You want to restore it, you want the kelp to come back, and you want the predators to come back so that they keep that urchin population down. And then you see that reef life comes back as well. Here you get even the cryptic fish. There's a kelp rockfish in the center there, right next to that juvenile kelp plant. And now we're just monitoring Long Point because we've restored it and restored a few acres there. And that is my coworker laying out a measuring tape, and that's all we're doing there now as well. And the next site looked equally as dismal, Long Point 2, and that one got restored the quickest, from April 2009 to November 2009. You look at the rocks there, and there's not much life on them, but the kelp came back quick, and the fish are loving it. And I'll throw a little bit of data at you guys. So that K Cove site, or Long Point 2, one of the simplest metrics you can use to see if the restoration worked is urchins and kelp. And so that's what macrocystis is the giant kelp. And you want to look at the density. How many plants are there per square meter? So if you look at the y-axis there on the top chart, it's the mean kelp density, or adults per square meter. And if you start your work along the x-axis there in April 2009, and if you look at the key, your reference site has kelp in it in April 2009. The restoration site does not. The control does not. The only difference between the reference and the control site are that the reference is a healthy kelp forest at the time you're doing work, and a control site is an urchin barren at the time you're doing work. So you're kind of looking at both extremes and trying to take your restoration site from control type conditions to reference type conditions. The names are arbitrary, we had to call them something. And then look at November 2009, the restoration site, the kelp density is about 2.5 adults per square meter. That's a super high density for any area. That just means a lot of little juvenile plants that if you try to swim through there, you're gonna get caught. And then December 10, February 12, it levels out as you get the natural succession that happens when kelp comes back. And then in terms of stipes per plant, stipes are those stems or those shoots that come up from kelp plants, you want that to increase. If you have a kelp plant with just one stipe plant, that's great, but if you have a kelp plant that has 100, that's like a big tree versus a little shoot. So that increased as well from April 2009 and kind of leveled out by February 2012. I'll touch on this just really briefly. The red urchins haven't seen so much of a typical pattern with. It's the purple urchins that are the major threat that create urchin barrens. They're the little ones. They just form large fronts underwater and just start hacking down kelp plants, as it were. And so you want to look at your top chart, the S. purpuratus density, which is the purple urchin. And if you look at urchins per square meter, that April 2009 number in the restoration site is high. You have over 20 urchins per square meter in the area that you're working in. And if you compare that to the control has almost the same. Very similar conditions, no control is perfect, but the reference had natural urchin densities of like 1 per square meter. That's the underwater jungle, that's the urchins in balance, that's what you're trying to get to. And we had great volunteers that year. I have to thank all the volunteers that came out, because in 6 months they took it from over 20 to less than 3 urchins per square meter in an acre site. So that shows some serious passion from unpaid workers. So that's huge. And back to this, I'm not going to touch on this, but just showing you again where these things are happening. K Cove, that's the one on the left. Those are the numbers that I showed you. Okay, so red versus purple, red versus purple. Red urchins are the commercial fishery. That's the big one that, you know, they're the size of a small pumpkin versus a purple urchin, which is the size of a small tennis ball maybe. The ones that we're pulling out are mostly the purple urchins. 97% from 2009 to 2011. That's mostly 2009. Only 3% of those urchins were red. So here's the thing. If reds aren't necessarily the problem and we have a commercial fishery for reds, why don't we just leave the reds down there? Because if we restore the kelp forest, the kelp comes back, those red urchins eat the kelp. You know, we have a lot of evidence showing that those reds can get bigger and become a great commercial product. So if you restore the kelp forest, leave the reds down there, you might also be helping out a local fishery and those urchin guys that are coming out of San Pedro and King Harbor. So I'm very proud of that. And right now we leave the reds down there. And you know, part of this greater partnership of the Kelp Project is with the commercial urchin divers. And we love the fact that they're diving these sites, they're doing the purples, but they can come back once there's kelp there and then harvest the reds for profit. So I think that's great. Just to show you a few more pictures of how it never looks down there at Underwater Arch Palos Verdes. That's what the divers call it. Fishermen call it something else. Surfers call it something else. Every local culture has a different name for all these different sites. But it's just a really complex reef. And it has such a huge amount of surface area that we really need a lot of help with a lot of volunteer divers because it takes more time to do all these urchins. There's another diver working down there. Look at the orange fish there, the Garibaldi. That is a California state marine fish. It's protected, and they love eating the urchins. They can't eat them when the urchins are intact, but they can if the divers are down there and basically breaking them up. So that is a direct energy input into the fish of this system, and rather than relocating the urchins, you're actually giving that energy straight to the fish that are on that reef, helping make it better. So that's one way of looking at it. This is our last slide here. If you are a rescue certified scuba diver, or if you're about to be, or you're interested in being one, that is the minimum requirement for our AAUS scientific diving requirements. So if you want to dive with us, if you want to volunteer, you get a free boat ride for a day. You get to come out, but we have liability and safety issues out there. So that's why we keep everyone, including myself, to these standards. So having said that, we always need volunteers. We go out during the weekday, the weekends, and every month is different. You just have to look at the schedule, get cleared, get us all the forms, and come out and help us. It's fun, it's social, and if you have a problem with insomnia, this is the way to fix it because you're tired at the end of the day. You're learning local marine ecology. You always have a dive buddy. Some people get certified and they're excited about diving. They pay $2,500 for gear, and then it's hard to schedule a weekend dive with a dive buddy. But just come out on the Waterkeeper boat, help us out, and the dive buddy's taken care of. And so if people are not a diver, we're a nonprofit 501c3. We always need members. You can do it online. Excellent question. So wasn't there an attempt to transfer sea otters? The sea otter is a great question. We get it all the time. Why don't you just move the sea otters in there? Why are you trying to be the otter? Why don't you just get the otter in there? It's better than you are. And they tried that in the late 80s. 1987 was a federal project, the Sea Otter Translocation Project. They took otters from the mainland and they tried to transport, I think it's about 140 of them, out to San Nicolas Island. And the point of that is we need to actively expand their range, because what if there's an oil spill on the mainland or some other tragedy? We're going to lose our southern sea otter. You know, they just come back from near extinction in 1938, and let's do something about this. When they moved the otters, they stressed the otters out. So you have to capture the otter. You're on a rebreather, a device that doesn't make bubbles. You have to come up from underneath it and trap it in a net, get it onto a boat in a cage. This is an animal that is related to the badgers and weasels, and it's actually not a very nice animal at all when you trap it. And so they killed a few. When they dropped them off at San Nicolas Island, some of them swam out to the ocean and died because they were trying to get home. Some of them actually made it home, made the swim, 60 plus miles or something from San Nicolas Island to the mainland. And but right now, I think there's only a couple dozen otters left at San Nicolas Island, and so the federal government has decided not to move any more otters, and just hope that we can expand their range naturally and try to set up good conditions for the otters, no pollution and good healthy habitat and stuff like that. When you look at the most common question with any group, whether it's a community group or school group, you know, when we were relocating the urchins, I would never tell people what we did with the urchins. And it was always a question, what do you do with the urchins? That's great, you're bringing back the kelp forest, but what is the cost? And so now I'm upfront about it, because it is, I don't want, you know, the urchin reduction to be some dark thing that we're hiding. I think we need to bring it out into the light and talk about why. Like, why are we having to do this? Like, if it's so expensive and time consuming, you know, and it's just us learning lessons as a society. If, you know, over 100 years ago, we hunted out the sea otter because the fur was so amazing. It made amazing coats, and the pelt is one of the most luxurious furs in the world. And if you go back over 100 years and say, slow it down, guys, we need to manage this better, we probably wouldn't be doing this project today. So I always like to say prevention is the number one. And as we make decisions today about future habitats, always being mindful of these types of things that can happen far down the road. You may think it's saving money now, but it might not in the future. And that brings up a great point about who's actually aware of kelp forests here in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, you get so wrapped up in your personal lives, and do you know about them? Do you know about their problems? And do you know who's doing the work and what they're doing about it? And so we're always trying to do what presentations we can with the limited staff we have, but you know, there's a lot of resources online. We were on the boat one day off of Long Point, you know, watching these kayakers come out off the coast, and we're so proud of ourselves. Wow, we're restoring the kelp forest, and these kayakers go by, and they say, "Oh, what is this stuff? It's worse than it was last time." The lobster's a great question. Okay, so and whenever you're talking about decisions of sustainability, you have to think about the economic, the ecological, and the social. And we have a history and a tradition of recreationally fishing lobster, going out as divers, getting a band of people together and hunting the lobster at night. And I've seen divers jump into 8-foot surf because, you know, on a normal day they would have said, I'm going home, I'm going to go eat breakfast or whatever. But when they're lobstering, it's the craze takes over, and it's just kind of part of the human condition. But so there's that fishery, there's the commercial fishery. Lobster is one of the most productive, profitable fisheries we have here in California. And then ecologically, that does have an effect. So right now, fisheries are managed species by species. And you say, how is that population doing? Is the lobster population okay? How are our numbers? Do our stock assessments? And is it able to regenerate itself year after year? If not, we need to control the take. If so, maybe we can allow more take. And so one thing they're not factoring into those stock assessments and how healthy that fishery is the food chain effects. So one more comprehensive way to look at it is take a step back and say, okay, the lobster population is fine, but, over 30% of the Palos Verdes reefs is covered in urchin barren. We could get a lot more productivity out of our peninsula if we have more kelp forest habitat. Should we decrease lobster take to allow more lobsters and have more kelp forest habitat? That's one question that people may think about. Besides species by species management, another way to start taking all these food chain effects into account is marine protected areas. So if you protect an entire reef, all those interconnections between lobster, urchin, kelp, sheephead, urchin, kelp, they need to be protected in a particular space. You need those sheephead and lobster in that area. If that area comes back, it could be seed for the areas that are fished. And so that is another way to do it, is combine marine protected areas with fishery management. So that's a great point, is are the urchins a necessary component of the kelp forest? And the answer is yes. As long as they're basically controlled and 1 to 2 per square meter, kelp forests do fine. They're an herbivore, so they'll eat all sorts of types of algae under normal conditions, and they help control that and basically allow opportunities for other algae to exist. So they under normal conditions, with no pollution and a sea otter or great predator there, like the sheephead or lobster, urchins are great.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.